Pacific Theater, Saipan, July 9, 1944. The cave mouth exhaled darkness onto the volcanic rock. Inside, pressed against stone that still held the night's coolness despite the morning sun, 23 Japanese women waited for death. Their military-issue cotton uniforms, once crisp and symbolic of their service to the emperor, now hung in tatters stained with coral dust and dried blood. Some clutched grenades with pins already loosened. Others held sharpened bamboo stakes against their own throats. Outside, the American voices grew louder, strange, guttural sounds in a language that represented everything they had been taught to fear. The youngest among them, a nursing auxiliary named Fumiko Nakamura, was 19 years old. She had been on Saipan for 8 months. In that time, she had learned to sleep through artillery barrages, to identify aircraft by engine sound alone, and to accept that capture by the Americans meant only one ending: violation, torture, and execution. This knowledge was not speculation. It was doctrine, repeated in training, reinforced by officers, whispered among the women during the endless nights in the field hospital bunkers. Now that moment had arrived. The Americans were here. What Fumiko and her companions could not know, crouched in that volcanic cave while their fingers trembled on grenade pins, was that they stood at the threshold of a collision between two completely irreconcilable versions of reality. For 3 years, the Japanese military indoctrination system had constructed an elaborate mythology about American savagery, a narrative so detailed, so consistently reinforced, that it had become psychological bedrock. These women had been trained to fear capture more than death itself. They had watched propaganda films showing American soldiers as subhuman monsters. They had heard testimonies from officers who claimed to have witnessed American atrocities. They had been issued cyanide capsules and instructed on the most efficient methods of self-destruction. Every element of their military education had pointed toward a single, inescapable conclusion: if the Americans captured you, death would be a mercy compared to what would follow. And now the Americans were calling into the cave in broken Japanese, telling them to come out, promising safety. The women heard only lies. They heard the voice of death trying to coax them into the open where the real horror would begin. The propaganda machine that had shaped their expectations was not a crude instrument. It was sophisticated, psychologically calculated, and devastatingly effective. Japanese military indoctrination drew upon deep cultural currents, concepts of honor, purity, and national identity that had been weaponized into tools of control. The Senjinkan, the military field code issued in 1941, explicitly stated that surrender was not merely tactically inadvisable but spiritually impossible for a true Japanese warrior. Article 8 declared, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to avoid leaving behind a dishonorable name." For male soldiers, this prohibition was framed in terms of warrior honor and loyalty to the emperor. For women serving in auxiliary roles, nurses, communications operators, comfort station workers, the prohibition carried an additional layer of gendered terror. They were told that American soldiers viewed Asian women not as human beings but as objects for sexual violence. The military instruction manuals were explicit about what capture would entail: gang rape, mutilation, public humiliation, and then execution. These were not presented as possibilities but as certainties. The message was clear. Death by your own hand was not suicide, but the final act of devotion to the emperor and the last protection of your sacred purity as a Japanese woman. This indoctrination began long before these women reached the Pacific battlefields. In Japan, the cult of Bushido had been reshaped by militarist ideologues into something that bore only superficial resemblance to its feudal origins. Traditional samurai philosophy had complex views on capture and survival, but the modern Japanese military stripped away nuance and created something absolute. Young women volunteering or being conscripted for auxiliary service received intensive ideological training. They memorized patriotic songs that glorified death in service to the nation. They studied texts describing Americans as materialistic demons lacking spiritual strength. They watched films depicting U.S. soldiers as racially inferior beings prone to violence and debauchery. One training film shown to female auxiliaries in 1943 purported to show the aftermath of American capture of Japanese nurses in the Philippines, images so disturbing that several women fainted during the screening. Years later, American investigators determined the footage was entirely fabricated, staged with actors and makeup artists, but its impact on the women who viewed it was devastatingly real. The film ended with a title card. This is the fate that awaits those who allow themselves to fall into enemy hands. Death is purity. Surrender is corruption. The women in the Saipan cave had absorbed these lessons completely. Fumiko Nakamura had joined the military nursing corps in early 1943, motivated by a genuine desire to serve the wounded and a naive patriotism that saw military service as the highest calling for a young Japanese woman. Her training at the military hospital in Yokohama had been rigorous, covering field surgery, tropical disease management, and combat first aid. But interwoven with the medical instruction was constant ideological reinforcement. Morning formations began with recitations pledging loyalty unto death. Evening lectures detailed the spiritual superiority of Japanese civilization and the bestial nature of the American enemy. When Fumiko and her cohort received their deployment orders for Saipan in October 1943, their commanding officer had gathered them for a final address. "You are going to the front lines of the Greater East Asia War," she told them, her voice steady and cold. "You may face capture. If that moment comes, remember, there is no shame in choosing purity through death. There is only shame in allowing the enemy to defile what is sacred. You carry cyanide. You carry grenades. These are your final protections. Use them without hesitation. The Emperor will honor your sacrifice. Japan will remember your devotion." Fumiko had arrived on Saipan believing she was serving a noble cause. The island was part of the inner defensive ring protecting the Japanese homeland, and the military hospital where she worked treated a steady stream of casualties from air raids and naval bombardments. The work was exhausting, the conditions primitive, but there was purpose in it. She held the hands of dying soldiers, changed bandages on wounds that festered in the tropical heat, and learned to function on 3 hours of sleep. She also learned to fear. By June 1944, as American forces prepared to invade Saipan, the fear had become omnipresent. Officers spoke openly about the coming battle as a decisive moment. Civilians on the island, Japanese colonists who had settled there in the 1920s and 1930s, were already committing suicide in family groups, throwing their children off cliffs before jumping themselves rather than face American capture. Fumiko watched these deaths from a distance and understood them as rational choices. She had been told what capture meant. She had seen the propaganda. When the American invasion began on June 15, she was not surprised by the intensity of the fighting or the speed of the American advance. She was only surprised that she was still alive to witness it. The battle for Saipan was a nightmare of modern warfare compressed into 3 weeks. American forces landed with overwhelming material superiority: planes, ships, tanks, artillery. The Japanese garrison fought with fanatical intensity, knowing that loss of Saipan would bring American bombers within range of the home islands. By July, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Japanese defensive lines had collapsed. Soldiers were conducting banzai charges not to win tactical victories, but to die with honor. Civilians were killing themselves at places that would later be named Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, and scattered throughout the island's caves and jungle, small groups of soldiers and auxiliaries hid, waiting for the end. Fumiko's hospital unit had fragmented during the American breakthrough. She found herself with a mixed group of nurses, communications workers, and a few wounded soldiers who could barely walk. They had retreated into the cave network in the island's interior, hoping perhaps for rescue by Japanese submarines or for the Americans to simply pass them by. Instead, they heard the steady advance of American patrols, The calls in broken Japanese to surrender, the occasional grenade or flamethrower blast clearing out other caves nearby. They knew their time was measured in hours. Inside the cave, the women prepared for death with ritual precision. Those who had cyanide capsules removed them from their pockets, examining the small glass vials in the dim light. Those with grenades checked the pins one final time. Some wrote final letters to parents they would never see again, using charcoal on scraps of paper. Others prayed silently, asking the emperor's forgiveness for failing in their duties or pleading for strength in the final moment. A few simply wept. Fumiko found herself oddly calm. She had been terrified during the bombardments, during the retreat through the jungle, during the long nights listening to distant explosions. But now, at the moment of death, she felt something close to peace. This was what she had been trained for. This was the culmination of her service. She would die as a true daughter of Japan, pure and undefiled. She held her cyanide capsule in her left hand and a grenade in her right, insurance policies against different scenarios. If she could take the poison quickly, that would be cleanest. If the Americans rushed the cave and there was no time, the grenade would serve. Either way, she would not allow them to touch her. She would not give them the satisfaction of her degradation. The American voices outside grew clearer. A loudspeaker crackled to life, and a voice speaking heavily accented Japanese echoed into the cave. Japanese soldiers and civilians inside, you will not be harmed. Come out with your hands visible. You will be given food and medical treatment. This is not a trick. You will not be harmed. The women exchanged glances. Some laughed bitterly at the transparent lie. Of course it was a trick. The Americans wanted them alive for their sick pleasures. The voice continued, patient and calm. We know you are afraid. We know what you have been told about us. It is not true. Come out slowly. No one will hurt you. The senior nursing officer in the cave, a woman named Lieutenant Yashiko Hasegawa, made a decision. In a voice that shook only slightly, she said, "We will use the grenades. When I give the signal, pull the pins and hold them close. We will die together as we have lived together in service to the Emperor. There is no shame in this. This is victory." Fumiko felt her fingers tighten on the grenade. She waited for the signal. What happened next would become, in retrospect, one of those pivotal moments where ideology collides with reality and shatters. An American soldier appeared at the cave entrance, but he did not charge in with weapons ready. Instead, he knelt down, making himself vulnerable, and placed a canteen of water and several chocolate bars on the ground just inside the cave mouth. Then he backed away, still speaking in that careful, accented Japanese. "We have placed gifts for you, water and chocolate. Take them, we will wait outside. When you are ready, come out, no one will hurt you." It was such a strange, unexpected gesture that several of the women simply stared. Lieutenant Hasegawa hissed, "It's poison, they're trying to poison us." But one of the women, an older communications operator who was desperately thirsty, could not resist. She crawled forward, grabbed the canteen, and drank. The others watched her, waiting for convulsions or death. Instead, she drank deeply and wiped her mouth. "It's just water," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Clean water." She picked up a chocolate bar, unwrapped it, and took a bite. "It's real chocolate, American chocolate." She began to cry. The certainty that had sustained them for hours began to crack. If the Americans wanted them dead or violated, why leave gifts? Why waste chocolate and water? Why speak gently? Why kneel at the cave entrance instead of throwing in grenades? These questions had no answers within the framework they had been given. The propaganda had not prepared them for this scenario. It had not accounted for kindness. Slowly, hesitantly, one of the women called out toward the cave entrance. "If we come out, you will not hurt us." The American voice replied immediately, "You will not be hurt. You have my word as an American soldier. Come out when you are ready." Another long silence followed. Then Lieutenant Hasegawa, her voice breaking, said, "I don't know what to believe anymore." It was the first admission of doubt, and it opened a floodgate. The women began talking over each other, debating, arguing. Some still insisted on suicide, convinced the Americans were playing an elaborate game. Others pointed to the chocolate, the water, the gentle voice. "Why would they bother with kindness if they planned to kill us?" one woman asked. No one had an answer. Fumiko felt something shifting inside her, a foundation crumbling. She had been so certain, so absolutely convinced of what awaited her, but the evidence before her, the chocolate, the water, the patient voice, did not fit the narrative. She thought about her training, about the propaganda films, about the officer who had given them cyanide and told them death was the only honor. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if it was all lies? What if the emperor's servants had lied to them? The thought was so heretical, so fundamentally destabilizing that she felt physically ill. If they had lied about the Americans, what else had they lied about? If surrender did not mean torture and death, then what did the last 3 years of suffering mean? What did the suicides of all those civilians at the cliffs mean? The questions multiplied, cascading, threatening to drown her. She looked down at the cyanide capsule in her hand and suddenly could not imagine swallowing it. Not yet. Not until she knew for certain. The women made their decision collectively, without formal agreement. One by one, they set down their weapons. Grenades were placed gently on the cave floor, pins still in place. Bamboo stakes were discarded. Cyanide capsules were pocketed. They helped each other stand, these women who had been ready to die together, and began moving toward the cave entrance. Lieutenant Hasegawa led them, her military bearing returning even as her hands trembled. They emerged into the blinding July sunlight, blinking and shielding their eyes, expecting at any moment for the trap to spring, for the bullets to fly, for their worst fears to be confirmed. Instead, they saw something they had never anticipated: a small group of American soldiers standing several meters away, weapons lowered, some with their hands raised in non-threatening gestures. One soldier was holding a white flag. Another was holding more chocolate bars. A third, who appeared to be a medic based on his armband, was carrying a medical kit and canteens. They looked at the Japanese women with expressions not of lust or hatred but of relief. "Thank you for coming out," the interpreter said in Japanese. "You are safe now. We will take you to a medical facility where you will be treated and cared for. No one will harm you." The moment of cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These were the demons from the propaganda films, the subhuman monsters who were supposed to rape and torture them. But they looked like ordinary men, young men, some barely older than Fumiko herself. They looked tired and dusty and strangely gentle. One of them smiled and waved. Another approached slowly, telegraphing every movement, and offered a canteen to Lieutenant Hasegawa. She took it with shaking hands and drank. The water was cool and clean. The American soldier nodded and stepped back. No grab, no attack, no violation, just water and a nod. Fumiko felt her legs give out. She collapsed onto the volcanic rock, not from injury or exhaustion, but from the sudden, vertiginous realization that everything she had believed was a lie. The Americans were not going to execute them. They were not going to rape them. They were going to feed them chocolate and give them water and treat them like human beings. The psychological whiplash was so severe that several of the women simply collapsed where they stood, sobbing uncontrollably. 3 years of terror, 3 years of certainty, 3 years of preparation for death, all rendered meaningless in an instant. They had been lied to. Systematically, comprehensively lied to. And the truth was so different from the lie that it broke something fundamental in their understanding of the world. The American soldiers responded to the women's collapse with concern and gentleness. Medics came forward and began checking for injuries, speaking softly, offering water and rations. They did not touch the women unnecessarily. They did not make threatening gestures. They simply provided care. One medic, a young man from Iowa named Private Robert Chen, had been trained in basic Japanese phrases specifically for dealing with prisoners of war. He knelt beside Fumiko and said in careful, slow Japanese, "You are injured." She shook her head, unable to speak. He nodded and placed a canteen and a ration bar beside her. "Eat, drink, rest." Then he moved on to check another woman. Fumiko stared at the ration bar. It was an American K-ration, the kind Japanese soldiers had been told contained diseased meat and poisoned preservatives. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside were crackers, cheese, candy, and cigarettes. She ate the crackers slowly, tasting salt and wheat. They were good. She ate the cheese. It was better than anything she had eaten in months. She unwrapped the candy, a piece of hard butterscotch, and put it in her mouth. The sweetness was shocking, almost painful. She sat on the ground eating American food and crying, not from sadness but from the sheer overwhelming strangeness of being alive and safe when she had been so certain she would be dead. The Americans transported the women to a prisoner-of-war processing facility near the beach, a temporary camp that had been set up to handle the thousands of Japanese prisoners and civilians who had surrendered or been captured during the Saipan campaign. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire, and armed guards stood at the perimeter, but inside the atmosphere was surprisingly calm. Japanese prisoners, soldiers, civilians, women, children, sat in organized groups while American personnel distributed food, water, and medical supplies. Fumiko and her companions were led to a section designated for female prisoners. They were given blankets, more food, and access to a medical tent where Navy corpsmen treated their injuries and illnesses. The care was professional and thorough. A corpsman cleaned the infected cuts on Fumiko's arms and gave her sulfanilamide powder to prevent further infection. Another corpsman examined her for signs of malnutrition and gave her vitamin supplements. No one asked her for sexual favors. No one threatened her. No one even raised their voice. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the mask of kindness to slip and reveal the monster beneath. But it never happened. The Americans simply treated her like a human being in need of help. Over the following days, as Fumiko began to process what had happened, she observed the American treatment of prisoners with increasing confusion and wonder. The food kept coming, 3 meals a day, every day. The portions were generous, almost wasteful. American soldiers ate the same rations they gave to prisoners, though the soldiers often had access to hot food from field kitchens, while prisoners ate from cans and packages. But even the packaged rations were extraordinary. Fumiko had grown used to Japanese military rations: rice balls that turned moldy in the tropical heat, pickled vegetables that provided minimal nutrition, occasional dried fish that tasted like salt and nothing else. The American rations were different. Each K-ration box contained more calories than a Japanese soldier received in an entire day. There were crackers and canned meat and cheese and candy and coffee and cigarettes. There was variety, different meals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There was abundance. Fumiko watched American soldiers casually discard half-eaten chocolate bars, and it seemed impossible. In the Japanese military, such waste would have been a court-martial offense. Here, it was ordinary. The sheer material excess of the American military became a recurring source of cognitive dissonance for the Japanese prisoners. Everything the women had been told about American society, that it was spiritually weak, materially exhausted by the war, on the verge of collapse, was contradicted by the evidence before their eyes. The Americans had new uniforms. They had trucks and jeeps in abundance. They had cigarettes and chocolate and coffee and chewing gum. They had medical supplies so plentiful that they used them on enemy prisoners without hesitation. They had cameras and radios and watches and pens. They had everything, and they had it casually, without apparent effort or strain. One afternoon, Fumiko watched an American soldier throw away a pair of worn boots and immediately receive a new pair from the supply tent. She thought about her own shoes, canvas and rope sandals that had fallen apart weeks ago, leaving her barefoot. She thought about Japanese soldiers she had treated who wore boots held together with wire and tape, who marched until their feet bled because there were no replacements. The contrast was staggering. How could Japan hope to win a war against a nation that threw away boots? The food became a powerful symbol of this disparity. In the POW camp, Japanese prisoners were fed better than they had been fed as active-duty military personnel. The irony was not lost on them. Fumiko gained weight for the first time in a year. Her skin, which had been gray and papery from malnutrition, began to regain color and elasticity. Other women experienced similar transformations. One of her companions, a communications operator who had been suffering from beriberi due to vitamin B deficiency, recovered completely after 2 weeks of American rations. The American medics seemed genuinely pleased by this improvement, as if nursing enemy prisoners back to health was a source of professional satisfaction. It was baffling. Fumiko had been taught that Americans were cruel and selfish, motivated only by personal gain and material comfort. But these soldiers seemed to take pride in caring for their prisoners. They smiled when prisoners gained weight. They expressed concern when prisoners were sick. They treated the Japanese women not as enemies or objects but as people. This treatment extended beyond mere physical care. The Americans set up an educational program in the POW camp, teaching basic English and providing information about American society and government. At first, Fumiko assumed this was propaganda designed to brainwash them into betraying Japan. She resisted attending the classes, but boredom eventually overcame suspicion, and she began sitting in on the English lessons. The American teacher, a young lieutenant named William Foster who had studied Japanese history at Berkeley before the war, was patient and encouraging. He taught them basic phrases: hello, thank you, please, excuse me. He taught them to read simple sentences. He showed them maps of the United States and explained the concept of federalism and representative democracy. He did not mock Japanese culture or demand that they renounce the emperor. He simply presented information and allowed them to draw their own conclusions. Fumiko found herself fascinated despite her reservations. The picture of America that emerged from these lessons bore no resemblance to the demonic empire of propaganda. Instead, it was a nation of farms and factories, cities and small towns, people who voted for their leaders and changed jobs when they wanted to and owned their own land. It sounded almost utopian, and Fumiko suspected much of it must be exaggeration or lies. But then she looked at the abundance around her, the food, the supplies, the casual wealth, and wondered if perhaps it was true. The psychological transformation that occurred in the POW camp was profound and deeply unsettling. Japanese prisoners found themselves in the position of having to reconstruct their entire worldview while still technically at war with their captors. The indoctrination they had received had not merely told them that surrender was shameful. It had told them that Americans were subhuman, that democracy was a sham, that Western civilization was degenerate and collapsing. Every day in the camp provided evidence that contradicted these claims. The Americans were not subhuman. They were ordinary people who happened to have better equipment and more food. Democracy was not a sham. These soldiers spoke openly about their eagerness to return home and vote in upcoming elections. Western civilization was not collapsing. It was producing jeeps and planes and bombs and rations at a rate that seemed impossible. The cognitive dissonance created by this gap between ideology and reality manifested in different ways. Some prisoners doubled down on their loyalty to the emperor, insisting that the apparent American strength was an illusion that would be shattered by Japan's spiritual superiority. Others quietly began to question everything they had been taught, and a few, like Fumiko, existed in a state of confused suspension, unable to fully believe the old lies but not yet ready to embrace new truths. The breaking point for Fumiko came 6 weeks into her captivity. A group of Japanese prisoners, including several of the women from her cave, were shown a newsreel film captured from Japanese forces. It was one of the propaganda films they had been shown during training, the one depicting American atrocities against Japanese nurses in the Philippines. Fumiko had seen it before and had been traumatized by it. Now, she watched it again with different eyes. The American officer screening the film paused it at several points to explain how the scenes had been staged with actors and makeup. He showed them how the injuries on the supposed victims were clearly latex prosthetics. He pointed out that the American soldiers in the film were actually Japanese actors wearing U.S. uniforms. He explained that the film had been created by the Army Propaganda Section in Tokyo and distributed to units throughout the Pacific to discourage surrender. The evidence was overwhelming. The film that had terrified Fumiko into preparing for suicide was a fake, a deliberate fabrication designed to control her through fear. She felt a surge of rage so intense that it made her physically ill. She had nearly died because of this lie. Her friends had died because of this lie. Thousands of civilians had thrown themselves off cliffs because of lies like this. The betrayal was total and unforgivable. That night Fumiko wrote a letter, not to her parents. She was too ashamed to tell them she had surrendered, but to her younger sister who was still in Japan training as a nursing auxiliary. She knew the letter would never reach her sister. The Americans might read it, but they would not send it to an enemy nation. But she needed to write it anyway, needed to set down the truth as a form of testimony. "Dear Keiko," she wrote in careful characters, "I am alive and a prisoner of the Americans. I am writing to tell you that everything we were taught is a lie. The Americans are not monsters, they are people like us. They have given us food and medicine. They have treated us with kindness. I am ashamed that I believed the lies. I am ashamed that I nearly killed myself rather than see the truth. If you receive orders to go to the front if you face capture, please do not believe what the officers tell you about the enemy. Surrender is not death, it is life. The Americans will not harm you. I have seen this with my own eyes. Please, please do not choose death when life is possible. I pray that you never face this choice, but if you do, remember what I have told you. Your sister Fumiko." She folded the letter and gave it to one of the American officers, asking him to keep it as a record. He read it, nodded gravely, and placed it in a file. Years later, after the war, that letter would be found in American archives and translated, becoming part of the historical record of Japanese POW experiences. The transformation of Japanese prisoners of war from terrified, indoctrinated soldiers into people capable of questioning their own government was neither universal nor complete. Many prisoners remained loyal to the emperor until the end of the war and beyond, but a significant number underwent what psychologists would later term ideological deconversion, a painful process of recognizing that the beliefs they had held as absolute truths were in fact carefully constructed lies. The Americans, perhaps inadvertently, facilitated this process through their treatment of prisoners. The material abundance, the medical care, the lack of torture or execution, all of these things created an environment where doubt could flourish. Japanese prisoners began comparing notes, sharing observations, asking questions. If the Americans were as weak and depraved as propaganda claimed, how had they conquered the Pacific island by island? If American society was collapsing, why were their soldiers so well-fed and well-equipped? If democracy was inferior to the emperor system, why did these democratic soldiers seem so confident and capable? These questions had no good answers within the framework of Japanese militarist ideology, and so the framework began to crack. The American military leadership had not planned this psychological effect, but they recognized its potential value. As the war progressed and more Japanese prisoners were taken, the U.S. military developed increasingly sophisticated programs for dealing with them. Psychological warfare units created propaganda materials specifically designed to encourage surrender by addressing Japanese fears. Leaflets dropped over Japanese positions included photographs of Japanese POWs eating American food and receiving medical treatment, along with testimonials from prisoners describing their humane treatment. Radio broadcasts featured Japanese prisoners reading messages to their former comrades, urging them to surrender. Some of these efforts were crude and ineffective. Japanese soldiers recognized propaganda when they saw it. But some efforts succeeded precisely because they addressed the fundamental disconnect between what Japanese soldiers had been told to expect and what actually happened to prisoners. A leaflet showing Japanese POWs eating chocolate and smiling was more effective than any amount of rhetoric about democracy or freedom. It provided visual, concrete evidence that contradicted the indoctrination. It planted a seed of doubt. By late 1944, the American military had taken thousands of Japanese prisoners across the Pacific theater. Each of these prisoners represented a small but significant victory over the ideology that had sustained Japanese resistance. The Japanese military doctrine that prohibited surrender had been designed to ensure that soldiers would fight to the death, making every battle a war of annihilation. But this doctrine depended on the prisoners never returning to tell their stories. As long as Japanese soldiers believed that surrender meant torture and execution, they would choose death. The moment that belief was contradicted by evidence, by photographs of POWs, by radio broadcasts, by leaflets, by rumors spread through the Japanese ranks, the doctrine began to lose its power. Not all at once and not completely, but incrementally. Each prisoner who was treated humanely was a crack in the edifice of indoctrination. Each photograph of a POW eating American food was evidence that the propaganda was false. The Japanese military high command recognized this danger and responded by doubling down on the prohibitions against surrender, threatening soldiers who were captured with posthumous disgrace for their families. But the material reality was stronger than the ideological threat. Soldiers facing starvation and certain death began to calculate that survival, even with shame, was preferable to honorable suicide. Fumiko spent 14 months as a prisoner of war. She was eventually transferred from Saipan to a larger POW facility in Hawaii, where conditions were even better than in the field camps. The Hawaiian facility had permanent barracks, hot showers, organized recreation programs, and access to Japanese-language newspapers printed by the prisoners themselves. It was, in many ways, more comfortable than her life had been in Japan before the war. She learned English fluently. She attended classes on American government and history. She worked in the camp hospital, using her nursing training to care for other prisoners. She made friends with some of the American guards and medical personnel, relationships that would have been unthinkable in the propaganda framework of absolute enmity. And slowly, painfully, she rebuilt her understanding of the world. The emperor was not divine. He was a man who had been used by militarists to wage a disastrous war. Japan was not invincible. It was a nation that had been led into catastrophe by leaders who valued ideology over reality. America was not a demonic enemy. It was a flawed but functioning democracy with resources and resilience that Japan could never match. These realizations were bitter because they meant accepting that she had been deceived, that the sacrifices she had made were in service of lies, that the suffering she had endured was unnecessary. But they were also liberating, because they meant she could imagine a future beyond war and death. When the war ended in August 1945, the prisoners in Hawaii learned the news through American radio broadcasts. The emperor's surrender speech, transmitted via crackling radio waves, reached the camp on August 15. Most of the prisoners listened in stunned silence. Some wept. A few attempted suicide, unable to accept the humiliation of national defeat. But most, like Fumiko, felt primarily relief. The war was over. They had survived. They would go home. The repatriation process took months. Fumiko did not return to Japan until February 1946, sailing on an American transport ship that had been converted for the purpose. The voyage was strange and melancholy. She stood on deck watching the Pacific pass below, thinking about all the violence this ocean had witnessed, all the men who had died fighting over these waters. She thought about the cave on Saipan and the moment she had nearly swallowed cyanide. She thought about the American soldier who had knelt at the cave entrance and offered chocolate. That gesture had saved her life. It had also shattered her world. Both things were true. Returning to Japan was harder than she had anticipated. The nation was devastated, defeated, occupied. Cities had been firebombed into ash. The population was starving. American occupation forces controlled the country. Fumiko's family greeted her with mixed emotions, joy that she was alive, shame that she had surrendered. She tried to explain what had happened, tried to tell them about the lies and the propaganda and the American kindness. But her parents, who had lost everything in the war, were not ready to hear that their sacrifices had been based on deception. Her younger sister Keiko had survived the war without seeing combat, and Fumiko was grateful for that mercy. She never told Keiko about the letter she had written. It seemed unnecessary now. The war was over. The lies had been exposed slowly, painfully, through defeat and occupation. Everyone knew now, or would know soon, that the emperor was not divine and the Americans were not demons. The knowledge had come too late to prevent the catastrophe, but perhaps it would prevent future ones. Fumiko eventually resumed her nursing career, working in a hospital in Tokyo. She married a schoolteacher in 1948, a man who had survived the war as an infantryman and who shared her complicated feelings about what Japan had done and what had been done to Japan. They had 2 children and built a quiet life in the wreckage of the old order. She never spoke publicly about her experiences as a POW until the 1970s, when a researcher interviewing former prisoners of war sought her out. In the interview, which was recorded and later transcribed, she described the moment of surrender in detail. The cave, the grenades, the voice calling in Japanese, the chocolate left at the entrance, the collapse when she realized she would live. The researcher asked her what she had learned from the experience. Fumiko thought for a long time before answering. "I learned," she said slowly, "that fear is a weapon. The people who sent us to war used fear to control us. They made us more afraid of surrender than of death. They made us believe that the enemy was not human. And we believed them because we trusted our leaders and because everyone around us believed the same thing. But fear is only powerful when it is the only information you have. The moment I tasted that chocolate, the moment the American soldier spoke gently instead of shooting, that was the moment fear lost its power. I learned that truth is stronger than fear, but only if you let yourself see it." The experience of Japanese female POWs like Fumiko was not unique, but it was also not universal. Thousands of Japanese women served in auxiliary military roles during the war, as nurses, communications operators, civilian employees, and their experiences of capture varied widely depending on circumstances, timing, and the particular American units they encountered. Some women were treated with exceptional care and respect. Others faced harassment or worse from American soldiers who did not always live up to their military's official standards. The historical record shows both the best and worst of wartime behavior. But what is significant is that the official policy of the U.S. military toward prisoners of war, including female prisoners, was humane treatment in accordance with the Geneva